Welcome, everyone. It's an enormous privilege that I have to be able to talk to you again today, the sixth of our classes in three spheres: East, West, and Digital. I really appreciate the fact that you've been patient with us. Shrikant's capabilities, talents in attracting a crowd and managing the situation got another big boost in my experience over this past weekend. He and I and a few others did a 5+ hour live session with groups of people up in Connecticut on both Friday and Saturday. Shrikant stepped in on Saturday and became our master of ceremonies. We tried to give him the MC Hammer name, but he didn't want that. So he will henceforth be known as MC Shrikant. Could I have the first slide, please?
Yes.
So just to remind you, this is session 6 out of 8. So we truly are in the home stretch here. We did 2 context sessions. It seems like so long ago. And then we did 2 fantastic sessions, which I recommend for anybody who hasn't had a chance to see them, to go back and watch them, on the East Sphere. First with our fellow researcher, John Alton, on the retrieval of chi and its impact on not just physics, but geopolitics, followed by our guest, Phil Midland, longtime partner of mine and co-founder of the Center for the Study of Digital Life. Last week, I did the Can the West Recover, for which my answer was yes, but, and today will be the concluding the 2 sessions on the West, in which I'm going to spell out my views, actually our views at the center, on how that might possibly come to pass. It has occurred to me that all of this may be something that isn't exactly grounded in what has been a 5-year-long effort at the center and a even longer effort, depending on when you want to count, 10 years plus, that we've been working on these subjects. So for those of you who are curious about my background or the origins of all of this, the Center for the Study of Digital Life, located at digitallife.center, is highly recommended. Furthermore, you can find my background, of course, as we normally do nowadays, on LinkedIn. So I'm going to begin very briefly by answering a question that came up last week. Then we'll get into the meat of today's presentation. I was asked last week, are you afraid of change? Are you in favor of a new dark age? The answer to both of those 2-part question is no. But in order to fill that out, you might have to do a little research. I'll just fast forward through this by saying that I started my first software company 40 years ago. My career then moved to Wall Street, where I was, for a period, considered by many to be a leading technology analyst, technology strategist, and ultimately investment banker. I brought America Online public 20 years after I had started that software company, and 20 years ago, roughly, in 1992. But The second part of that question is a fascinating study that we should conduct at some point, which is to say an examination of what people mean by a dark age. Needless to say, a dark age, by most definitions, is no longer possible. We are carrying around effectively the entirety of human knowledge in our pockets. Some of that might be considered to be dark, but a lot of it would be considered to be highly enlightening. So we are not going back, but we are retrieving something absolutely crucial. And that retrieval, which we exercised with some great flourishes over the course of the past couple of days, will be the topic of today's presentation. Next slide, please. I don't know that there are many people who have linked the retrieval of natural law with new sciences. If anyone wants to add to my ignorance, or rather resolve my ignorance on that topic, I look forward to it in the Q&A. As we said last week, the decline of the West does have a path to potential recovery. The key to that is a shift in our inner senses from fantasy, make-believe, the world in which we live today, the world that appears to be so chaotic, the world that appears, frankly, to be falling apart. With memory, we can overcome all of those circumstances when fantasy is set aside. So, remembering the West sphere before the intervention of the printing press, before modernity began, becomes the crucial maneuver here. Now, obviously, I'm not a believer in linear history. Those who ask questions about fears about new technologies, potential recovery of a dark age, tend to be those, again, I'm hoping this comes up in the Q&A. The Q&A has been fantastic, by the way. This has really made all of this so exciting for me. The linearity of historic progress is an effect of the printing press. That is what got us off track and is now in the process of being overturned. Retrieval, as we also emphasized, is the key quadrant in what Marshall McLuhan developed as the tetrad heuristic. So for those interested in a more in-depth understanding of what that means, I would advise you might want to take a look, and maybe we'll do one of these days, a specific deep dive on McLuhan's 1988 Laws of Media, The New Science, subtitled. So we're really now embellishing on work that was done at this point more than 30 years ago. Clearly, retrieval is not a simple circle, though. We are not returning to the past. That's not possible. We're not simply holding our hands up, asking the world to stop, somehow suggesting that tradition is what we must embrace, which may have underlied that question. Instead, what we are doing is retrieving previous sensibilities and attitudes in a completely different technological environment. Next slide, please. This topic occupied much of the presentation that Shrikant conducted yesterday in Weston, Connecticut. I'm not going to spend as much time today as we did yesterday, but this sequence of communications paradigms underlies all of the work that we are doing. There is a lot of material in Shrikant's 52 Living Ideas, specifically on the transition from an archaic oral-based culture to a scribal. That doesn't simply mean writing. It critically includes literacy, reading and writing on a very broad basis is the basis of civilization. Archaic cultures, in my view, should not be called civilized. There are lots of other terms we can use for that. But the invention in roughly 500 BC, plus or minus, and this occurred in many different places in the world in different times, but it absolutely occurred in both the East and the West. China went through a process, Europe went through the process, roughly overlapping in time. Civilization required sacred texts. So the invention of this notion, in some sense, is Karl Jasper's description and coining the term the axial age, the age on which human life turned. And he was quite clear that the great religions were the direct result of this shift in communications capabilities. That was over, however, quite a while ago.
Mark, let me interrupt just for a second. I just want to give people an heads up on the structure of this entire presentation. So Mark is presenting now. Again, as I always remind folks, in this series, you're going to be hit by a fire hose of ideas. And the only way to handle that is to use this medium of pen and paper, which was the heart of the scribal age. Please keep track of all the questions that you have. There will be plenty of time for questions. Okay, so formulate all your questions, make your observations in writing. We will be going to it immediately after this presentation. Go ahead, Mark.
I'm sure many of you have experienced this. I know I have. It makes an enormous difference when you use your hands to record what you are thinking. There is an anatomical, there's a physiological, there's a neurological linkage between inscribing something and our ability to remember it. So I apologize. In the previous sessions, I have paused before we got into the meat of materials and handed it to Shrikant. He's exactly right to remind me of that. The shift from a civilized scribal world to what we would call a modern world was a direct result of the invention of movable type in the 15th century. I haven't started these approximate dates, however, with 1450 because it took a lot of time. This is a very important distinction between the shifts in paradigms before today, in which the pace of events is remarkably fast, not even generational, compressed to a sub-generational level. But it took perhaps a century or more for the scribal world to throw its hands up in the air and say, we're on the losing side here. Circle the wagons. Now, as Everybody who's watched a Western where the settlers are circling the wagons, as you know very well, that's a terrible strategy unless the cavalry is coming. So the circling of the wagons by the Scribal world, which persisted particularly in the West sphere, was a failure. There was no cavalry. In fact, it was the cavalry who were circling their wagons. There was no one coming to the rescue. The modern world based upon the printing press, many of you will be familiar with the role that Descartes played in all of this. You may have read or figured out on your own that Descartes' cogito ergo sum separated the mind from the body. This is very often referred to as the shift from a mono to a dualistic view of culture. Again, just like the shift from archaic oral to civilized scribal, for which a library could be devoted, there's also a maybe somewhat smaller library, but still a library of fantastic research on the shift from scribal to print. But that wasn't the end of the process either. Descartes' first work literally described the human mind as an engine. The view that human beings can be modeled by mechanical devices, typically clocks, for instance. So I've just been reading some material that came out of Basel, Switzerland. The Swiss watch industry and the development of timekeeping is enormously important for the print era. You might say that under scribal conditions, there was a very different understanding of time, much as there was in the oral tradition. So how cultures view time, which turns out to be a critical component of the inner senses involved, particularly the memory component. As you move away from a organic understanding of time, as you move into a progressive understanding of time, you have begun to destroy your memory. You have replaced it with innovation. There's a fascinating book that was serialized on the web by a group from McGill in Montreal on the whole topic of the meaning of the word innovation. It turns out that under scribal conditions, innovation was considered a negative. The word, particularly in English, but not just in English, was used to describe innovators as people who were ignorant, people who were unaware of the critical knowledge that humanity had achieved. And that transitioned rather quickly under print conditions into a positive. Etymology, the source of words, is a really important form of memory. The Oxford English Dictionary is one of the places where you can go to get some sense of this. And for those of you who have used the OED, you know it sequences various definitions of words based upon the time they were first used. So you can trace how the meaning of words changes through these communications paradigms. The view that human beings are engines or machines or clocks would have made no sense at all under scribal conditions. But it swept across civilization, Western civilization, and created the modern age. I'm here to tell you today, we no longer live in the modern world. And in fact, that undermining of the modern world, the print-based world, happened not that long ago. My grandparents, and perhaps yours as well, were born in the 19th century. So it's only a couple of generations ago. Now I'm 73 years old, so there are a couple of generations ahead of me, but still, and the sweep of events here, there are people whose parents or grandparents lived in a modern age, only to have that knocked out from underneath them. And art is an obvious way to think of this. The electric age gave us a radically different approach to art. Marshall McLuhan, who was an anchor of many of the ways that we approach these topics, was an English professor. So he did a great deal of work on understanding how these communications paradigms are reflected in the art that is produced under these environmental conditions as they change. We have come to understand that electric communication paradigm, the one in which I would guess virtually everybody on this session 6 were born and grew up in, as did their parents, that was an age that has ultimately produced a world that is anchored in fantasy, in make-believe. And it is the transition we're now living through from the electric paradigm to the digital paradigm that is what causes our lives to seem to be so chaotic. In economic terms, political terms, religious terms, you name it. It appears that everything has been tossed up in the air. It appears that Newtonian or Einsteinian attempts to understand gravity have been overturned, and somehow gravity has been erased. It's as if we're all in those fake spaceships that go up high enough that they can reach a parabolic reversal, and briefly we'll see Richard Branson floating around in the air. We're all floating around in the air. We've lost our ground. We're in the process of trying find a new one. And so the substance of what we've been talking about, and will continue through the end of this course, talk about, is this transition from a fantasy world to a memory-based world. I know that is abstract, no matter how many examples I give you, and yet I'm certain that everyone on this call has been experiencing it, sometimes favorably, probably more frequently, in some form of terror, which is only going to become more accentuated. So keep these paradigms in mind, particularly as we go next week and the week after that into the digital sphere. Next slide, please. So this entire presentation is merely about the retrieval of natural law, which my guess is very few people have studied. It is rarely taught today. That will change rapidly. The educational system that most of us would agree has collapsed at every level will return to. In fact, there's a large cohort of 10, 15-year-olds who have gone through homeschooling, which has been explicitly based on natural law. I'm not today or in the previous sessions in this course, I'm not trying to forecast anything for you. The way we approach things at the center is to try to notice those things that are not otherwise being noticed. So what I'm describing to you is a situation which has already occurred. We have already begun to retrieve natural law. You go to Wikipedia entry under natural law, which is maybe where a lot of people would go since they're not familiar with the term. In the first paragraph, it will say, Wikipedia says, if that's what you prefer, that natural law is a close observation of human nature. Very interesting way of putting this. So instead of living in a world in which we assert there is no such thing as human nature, in fact, humans are so malleable that we can invent a new nature for humans. That is not our view. Specifically, natural law describes what is not man-made. It is not what legal scholars would call positive law, or in the more traditional form of this, nomos. That is not natural law. Aristotle is the focus of much of our research, to the extent that the history of philosophy has been a series of footnotes to Plato, as Whitehead asserted. We are arguing against that. We are arguing not to discard or throw away Plato, but rather to recognize that Plato's student Aristotle went far beyond what Plato was capable of understanding. In Aristotle's book, which I recommend to you, along with many of his other texts, in the Rhetoric, Book 1, Chapter 13, Aristotle specifically says that universal law is the law of nature. Now, some of you will be familiar with the important 20th century economist Friedrich von Hayek. Hayek's version of this is that orderliness in the world is not the product of human will. It is not a human invention. It's a characteristic of nature itself. This view, despite the fact that Hayek could remind us of this in the 20th century, came under very aggressive attack by many in the Enlightenment. See, the title of the slide is that natural law was discarded with increasing aggressiveness in a period of history that we call the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th centuries, centered in England, Scotland, France. The shift in European history could be condensed to Hobbes's approach to this question. And for Hobbes, legal positivism focused on the rights granted to citizens by the king, not from nature, not from God, but from the human being, the sovereign. And so the closely linked understanding of virtue and vice linked to natural law was tossed out the window, replaced with contractual relationships, and replaced with the famous phrase, the war of all against all. So I know that Debbie Newman studied common law and its evolution in her course to become a lawyer. My guess is there may be a few other lawyers here. As I'm talking about natural law, it might remind you of common law. This is exactly the territory in which we're operating. Where do laws come from? Does nature give us the basis of laws, or do human beings invent the laws? Positivism associated with Hobbes. Our view, of course, is that we are returning to an understanding of how nature gives us the laws, not human beings. This then, of course, leads us directly into the topic of science. Next slide, please. Those of us who might imagine that science began for the very first time with the establishment in the 17th century, with the Restoration in England, with the Royal Society of London, or with the contrary efforts by Leibniz as he attempted to set up alternative societies, both in Germany and in Russia, in St. Petersburg and Berlin. This was at the heart of the question that Leibniz was wrestling with. Science was not invented in the 17th century. It may well be the question of a dark age relates to that question, not the question of whether we have any knowledge, not the question of whether we can access that knowledge, but whether or not we're making up the laws or nature's giving us the laws. Under scribal conditions, science was conducted based upon natural law. The specific formulation of that, as it was understood in the earliest universities, which began in the 12th and 13th centuries and carried all the way forward. So you might wonder, why do we have a bachelor's degree? Why do we have a master's degree? What do those words even mean? Why do people get up at graduations dressed up in cap and gown? This is a carryover from the earliest universities. And the specific format in which this was taught fell under the 4 categories of geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. Again, I'll point to Debbie Newman, because I'm going to encourage her to ask some questions here today. She's a music major with a minor in mathematics. The relationship between music and mathematics, I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with. The quadrivium accompanied the trivium. One of the other projects that the center is involved with is starting a graduate school based around the trivium and the quadrivium. But it was going on even earlier than that. There was a massive explosion of scientific investigation in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. In Western Europe, the Carolingian Renaissance was a high watermark for this. So you probably have heard of Charlemagne. You may not have heard of the English monk Alcuin, who led his educational efforts. But this was very much where the formulation of the trivium and quadrivium and the scientific basis of human knowledge took place, particularly in Western Europe. But not just there. For those who are not familiar with the Baghdad House of Wisdom, I would encourage you to take some effort to research this. 8th, 9th, 10th, into the 11th century, Islam led the world, the whole world, in its pursuit of scientific investigation. You can go and read compendiums of this. You can take a look at what the accomplishments were. You can recognize that algebra is actually an Arabic term. And so we have 500 plus years of scientific research before, actually longer than that, almost a millennium of scientific understanding before the Royal Society is finally established in London. The rise of the universities, starting in places like Paris, Bologna, Cambridge, actually Oxford to begin with. Cambridge is a spin-off of Oxford. This is what we are now going to be retrieving. The rise of the universities is something which we are now going to be remembering. And in particular, we are going to base our natural law understanding on one of the very earliest scientists, Aristotle. Aristotle had been a part of these various other efforts, particularly in Islam, and the Latin West learned about Aristotle via Islam. All of this, however, came to a radical fork in the road. And as Yogi Berra, one of my favorite philosophers, suggested, we took that fork. I'm going to point you to another reference here. If you're familiar with Peter Ramos, who operated out of Paris, you might be familiar with the fact that there is an excellent discussion of the impact of Ramos in the 1956 PhD thesis by Walter Ong. Walter Ong was a protege of Marshall McLuhan. And the title of his thesis is simply Ramos, Method, and the Decay of Dialogue. Science had been deeply embedded in dialogue, and it was replaced by method. One of the examples of this that I like to cite is the organization of Thomas Jefferson's library. So every one of us, you see the bookshelves behind Shrikant's head. If I picked up the camera here and rotated it 90 degrees, you'd see a lot of bookshelves within reach of where I'm sitting. You probably have all faced the dilemma, how do I organize my library? So Thomas Jefferson took on the task of supplying, in fact, selling his personal library to Congress. The United States Library of Congress began with that transaction. So the dilemma of how you organize bookshelves is one that we've all had to wrestle with. Doesn't have to be a bookshelf, could be folders in your computer, could be any number of ways of attempting to diagram out human knowledge. And you would quickly come against the problem if there is no universal method for accomplishing that. In Thomas Jefferson's case, it turns out that he organized his library based on the height of the book. Some people organize their libraries based upon the color of the book binding, which may be akin to what Jefferson did. Why did he do this? And the reason, of course, is because he built his own bookshelves. And if you have taken a look at many people's libraries, you will notice that the height of the book doesn't match. If you organize things based upon a Library of Congress basis or whatever, you're going to wind up with many different size books next to each other. Shrikant looks like he has somewhat solved that problem. Maybe he only buys books that all have the same height to fit within these very regular bookshelves. Thomas Jefferson, when he made the recommendation to the US Congress He sold it, and you can find online actually the method, which is not the way that Jefferson himself thought about these things, but the method that was necessary to make this into a large public library. Next slide, please. Now here I'm going to cross into an area that would suggest yet a different way of organizing human knowledge. It turns out that under medieval scribal conditions, exegesis, which is the process of organizing and critically commenting on human knowledge, was based upon 4 related senses of human knowledge. Our suggestion is that we are returning to something under completely different technological conditions, which resembles this form of organization. This is a form of organization before method, before the Library of Congress organization, before all of those print and ultimately electric-based organizations. And from their standpoint, those 4 senses had to apply and had to generate a correspondence between what was known as the book of nature, so this is obviously natural law, and the book of God, which is to say the New Testament. So they were applying the same organizational and critical techniques to these 2 related realms. One of the most significant modern commentators on this is the French theologian Henri Lubac. Lubac was part of a wider movement in the 20th century called, in French, ressourcement. What this was trying to do was to go back and recover an earlier approach. Now, for those of you who have been involved with the history of science, might have been involved with even the history of ideas, you will have quickly noticed this problem of reductionism. The conflict between reductionism and various efforts to overcome it has probably dominated much of the discussion of science in the 20th century. I do not know of anyone who has led the effort to overcome reductionist science who has made the approach one of retrieving natural law. Anyone listening to this, when we get to the Q&A, please straighten me out. These various efforts at overcoming the reductionism associated initially with the printing press, associated with the dualism coming from Descartes, has been, Descartes, that's a good one, have been failures, one after the other, after the other. Most recently, complexity theory has completely failed to deliver on its now close to 30-year promise, with a $10 million blank check being written by the United States government's Department of Energy. Go sort this all out. Give us a non-reductionist science. It has not accomplished its goals. I'm going to cite a couple of other authors here for you. Giambattista Vico wrote 3 different versions in Italian of his La Scienza Nuovo. This is an outstanding example under print conditions to somehow try to recover what had been lost. Needless to say, he failed. Much more recently, and much more close to what we're doing in these sessions, was Marshall McLuhan and his son Eric, who published their Laws of Media, the New Sciences, in 1988. As I have noted often, there are hundreds, maybe 1,000 or more, self-professed McLuhan scholars in the world. I honestly don't know of any of them, particularly the ones who get the most attention, who have used laws of media. If you wish to start understanding McLuhan, that's where I would go. I'm now going to give you 3 examples of this application of the 4 senses. First of all, the tetrad. So we've touched upon this before. The 4 quadrants of the tetrad are enhance, obsolesce, flip, originally called reverse, and retrieve. We ended our 5+ hour discussion with the audience yesterday at Shrikant's correct insistence that we study the tetrad. You've all experienced how Shrikant organizes these events, and in particular, how he orchestrates the Q&A. We're about to transition into the Q&A for what we're doing today. I think there's only one more slide. How are we doing on time, Shrikant?
We're fine. You can take maybe 5 to 10 minutes more if you would like.
Okay. I'll go through this quickly. The 4 senses described by Henri Lubac in his 4-volume medieval exegesis are mapping, jumping to the very bottom item here. I'll come back to causality along the way. The 4 senses that de Lubac emphasized, this was not his idea. He didn't decide he was going to impose this frame. You will find this all throughout Scribal literature. Before the printing press overturned all of this, over and over again, you will find the 4 senses: the moral sense, the allegorical sense, the anagogical sense, and the literal sense. I'm not going to go through a description here today. It would probably take an entire meetup to do that. But I'm telling you that this pattern of 4 simultaneous ways of viewing human knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge, is where we are now going. We are no longer going to simply be able to imagine in causal terms, if we even can still grasp a hold of efficient or motive or energetic causality. That, by the way, of the 4 causes outlined by Aristotle, that was the last to go. But statistics has largely replaced even efficient causality. We must return to an understanding of the 4 senses of causality: efficient, material, final, and formal. This is a topic I know Shrikant enjoys. He spoke about this at some length over the weekend. I hope he's not disappointed that I'm taking you now to the last slide. New paradigm, new sciences. We have no choice. As Thomas Kuhn, in his 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, described all of this, albeit in a confused and, for many people, when they read it today, the confusion that Kuhn had is probably a lot more evident than it was when the book was first published. His entire thesis was, at some point, the previous science has been stretched so far that it no longer covers our experience, and it snaps. And we're forced to go back, examine our premises, and build new sciences. He portrayed this as a relatively superficial, linear progression in problem solving. That's a print oriented way of understanding this. That's not what happened. Very importantly, Kuhn did not understand or base his discussion on the communications paradigms, which has been our approach. Furthermore, it was unclear what paradigm even meant. People have gone through scientific revolutions and come up with long lists of how Kuhn used the term paradigm. 34 is the number that sticks in my mind. He was writing about physics, but he wrote the book at the Center for the Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. So social science was what he was really talking about, adding more confusion. New paradigm means new behaviors and new attitudes. It means an examination of the ground from which our premises come. And indeed, there's one more last slide. Could I have it, please? So, is this a tweaking? Is this a readjustment? Did we get in with a screwdriver? Did we turn it an eighth of a turn and we've now got things aligned? No. I'm talking about something really fundamental. We must replace those print-based Enlightenment premises with Scribal premises in order to move forward in scientific revolutions. And so I've listed a series of sciences here for you. My guess is there are people in this group who have studied one or more, or maybe all of these sciences. Physics is not going to achieve what it attempts to achieve with string theory. Not going to happen. And indeed, our fundamental understanding of the operations of energy, which impinges on our lives in so many ways, I would recommend you go back and listen to the first of the two, which is, say, 2 weeks ago, East Sphere discussion by John Alton on the retrieval of chi. Anthropology is at a dead end. The American Anthropological Association removed human from its mission statement. That ain't anthropology anymore. It must incorporate the effects of technology. Sociology has to be completely revamped, and in particular, the notion that human beings can do whatever they want, make up whatever laws they want, cannot survive a reassertion of natural law. Psychology has been a focus that we've done at the center. It must retrieve the inner senses. We've done a lot of work on that. I would recommend it to you if you are interested. If you go to the digitallife.center website, you will find a 200+ page book under the heading of journal, which will assist in the retrieval of inner senses. History cannot remain Whig history. It cannot remain a linear progressive history. It has to return to an understanding of cycles. Philosophy cannot no longer be based on contradictions. It must rebase itself on an understanding of contraries. We can help you with that too. And medicine, I remember the first time I went to a pharmacy in Beijing, and they divided the pharmacy into traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, and Western medicine. This was in one of the most heavily trafficked areas in downtown Beijing, just a short distance away from the Forbidden City. I stood there for 10 minutes watching people come through the door, wondering which way they would go. This is another one of those forks in the road. Traditional medicine was where the people were going, not Western medicine. And so we have an enormous amount of work to do to retool medicine. To the end slide here, please. I hope this has been stimulating. I hope the retrieval of natural law and the opportunity we all have to invent new sciences is an exciting prospect for you. This is not a dark age we're heading into. This is also not an enlightenment we're heading into. We're heading into something that is radically different, and it will be an enormous challenge and opportunity for all of us, for our children and grandchildren, to carry out this retrieval of natural law and the establishment of new sciences. Thank you all very much.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. All right. So this has covered a lot of ground. So folks, now it's time for questions. As always, we're going to take all the questions from you, and then I'm going to organize them. Please go ahead and ask questions. And then once I've organized them, I'm going to organize them by general to more specific. Okay, wonderful. This is great feedback. But we do want your questions. And I'll organize all of them, and then we're going to go through them one by one. So folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom if you would like to ask a question. Okay, we'll start with A. Vanderberg, and try to keep your questions brief so that we can get to as many questions as we possibly can. A. Vanderberg, what's your question?
If you talk about natural laws, could you translate that into body language and say that memory is organized like the organic structures in us, complex molecules, DNA, cells, organs, etc.?
Got it. Thank you. How does natural law relate to the organic structures that we have within our body? Okay, folks, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to ask questions. Otherwise, I have tons of questions for Mark, but I want your questions to take priority. Mike, what's your question?
I'm interested in how Jefferson organized the library. Would like to know much more about it.
Got
There's
it.
another library called the Gutenberg Library that Google organized, and they indexed everything on an n-dimensional hypersphere, so you can query it by natural language. One more comment. There's
Not comment, questions, please.
One more question. Another organization that might be considered is the so-called Library of Babel, which is part of the magical realism theory, which is organized in an infinite number of hypercubes.
Wonderful.
Again, queryable by natural language. Is that, you talk about natural law, is natural language query and network complexity part of your paradigm?
Wonderful. Thank you. What are the various ways in which libraries can be organized, have been organized, and what are your thoughts about the organization of libraries? Next up is going to be Joyce Searle, followed by John. Joyce.
Hi. So there was an article a week or so ago in The Verge where a professor is talking about how she's noticing that her students don't know what a file is. Like, oh, where do you have that? Like, she'll ask the students, where is that organized on your computer? And where's the file? And they'll be like, they don't know what a file is because they think everything is searchable. Everything is searchable. And if you grew up with Google, everything is searchable. Why would you need a file? Everything is a laundry basket where you have all the clean laundry in it. And when you need socks, you just go find the socks. You never put anything away. So what I want to know is how do we take that into account that like we're training these kids to not think in a library way, an organized way. They don't even know what a file is. And is that required? Or they just will learn through natural law by observation that, how it might work some other way.
Excellent question,
Let me just
Joyce.
comment here quickly, Joyce. Thank you very much for joining us. And as you would have recognized, my commentary about losing gravity, actually, I believe originated with your comments along with your husband, my friend Doc.
Yes, it was. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joyce. So I'm going to put that question: is it how do we maintain, how do we hold on to organization of knowledge in a world where Google search is taken for granted? All right. Next up is John.
Hi, I'm really fascinated by Hayek, and you mentioned him, and I skimmed one of his books, which I thought was very fascinating, but I don't know him very well. But one of his most famous students, I understand, was Margaret Thatcher, who famously said, "There is no such thing as sociology." So I'm curious about this natural law when it is retrieved in our time. What would be the first signs that will let us know this natural law has been retrieved? And did Margaret Thatcher, was she an example of a retrieval of natural law?
Thank you. Thank you, John. All right, folks, I'm going to give you a couple more, about a minute more to add more questions. And then we're going to go with answers to the questions that have already been put on the table. After we start going through the answers, you're still welcome to go ahead and put in more questions on the table. But at that time, go ahead and put the questions in the chat. Mike, do you have a question or a comment? Only questions, please. Go ahead.
Only questions. Hobbes' question about the natural need of man is to have an ordered universe created by a benevolent tyrant. Is that part of your comment of natural law, or let everybody be their own tyrant?
Thank you. So I'm going to put that as on a question on Hobbes, which we will, because it is more specific, we'll take it towards the end. Next up is Lisa. Lisa, go ahead.
I raised my hand by accident. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. All right, folks. So we're now going to go to the answers. Let me see here. Organization, everything. Sorry. Okay. All right. So first one, let's go with Vanderburg's question. Is this natural law analogous to organizations in nature, in biological systems?
Absolutely, yes. When I was an undergraduate, University of Wisconsin, graduated college in 1970, high school in 1966. I had to face the yogi fork in the road. And there were really only two alternatives: biology or physics. I chose biology. So my undergraduate major was in evolutionary genetics. My failed attempt at a PhD at UW-Madison was in molecular biology. I'm one of these people who asserts that all living things are not systems, and attempting to understand them as systems, attempting to mathematize biology is a dead end. So you have obviously researched this question. You've raised a version of this last week. I would just suggest to you, as you probably have already done, that you deliberately contrast systems thinking with organic thinking. What I've been presenting here and what natural law promotes is organic system thinking, not systems thinking.
Thank you, Mark. Next question was about Hayek. I want to take that as an open-ended question,
Sure.
because it gives you an opportunity of talking about what natural law looks like in action. So could you talk a little bit about Hayek and how his thinking about natural law shapes his other thoughts? Go ahead.
I will highly recommend Hayek to you. I will not highly recommend Margaret Thatcher to you. To the degree that Margaret Thatcher may have actually studied with or about Hayek, my guess is that she missed the point. Hayek began studying psychology in Vienna. And as you might imagine, there were a few other psychologists in town. So his parents, as often happens in these cases, suggested that he might want to, if he wanted to get a job someplace, study something else. And so we mostly think of Hayek as an economist, and that is probably the facet of Hayek that Thatcher picked up on. All of that stood on top of a deeply and thoughtfully constructed understanding of the sensory order. Specifically, in 1952, I believe, Hayek returned to his earliest form of study and published a book called The Sensory Order. That's natural law. And the result of that was a description of the limitations on human knowledge. So I will confess that I have never been a fan or spent enough time to be able to lay out in careful terms what Margaret Thatcher thought was the case. But my guess is that she believed that she knew things that Hayek would have told her you can't possibly know. The sensory order, which is what links our external sensory faculties, ultimately with our intellect, is a very intricate, organic linking of faculties. There is no mathematical way to get from the external senses to an intellectual formulation that will be accurate. And so it is that in between that is the sensory order. Now, Hayek came from a family of minor nobility, landed aristocrats, if you will, in Austria. And I'm going to suggest to you that that was probably one of the few places, one of the few cultures at that time where natural law would have been in the water supply, so to speak. So I'm going to suggest that Hayek is a worthy, particularly because of his frequently being misunderstood, frequently being mischaracterized, frequently being, in fact, reduced to something that he wasn't saying. I went to a university in Guatemala at the invitation of Bill Frezza. Bill has not joined us today because he and his wife are in Rome, finishing up a vacation there. So I hope when Bill gets back, he has a chance to listen to this. He is a serious student of Hayek. This university, UFM, in Guatemala, is deliberately based on Hayek. I went there in the hopes that I could get them to study what I would call the true Hayek, and I ran into just the problems that you cited. They would likely have been more interested in Margaret Thatcher than in Hayek, even though they said Hayek was the origin of this. So this contrast between an organic, natural, lawful understanding and attempts to reduce it, attempts to turn it into a method, attempts to turn it into a org chart, the Peter Ramos approach. What I'm suggesting to you is that we have already, in so many ways, recognized the failure of that approach. We don't have to predict this. It's already happened. And we're going to follow through in a much wider basis. And I would hope that Hayek becomes one of the more widely read figures from the 20th century who was situated right in the middle of this for just the reasons that you asked. Thank you.
Excellent. Now let's flip to the opposite side, Hobbes. Can you talk a little bit about Hobbes' view of the positive law and how it is opposed to the idea of natural law?
Well, I think the way the question concluded, in many ways, is really all you have to know. The suggestion that we do not get order from nature, but rather have to invent it. Otherwise, it would be a war of all against all, therefore requiring a benevolent tyrant, absolutely leads to the view that everyone becomes a tyrant in their own lives. I think that's the way the question ended. As we ended our presentation yesterday, doing a tetrad, or actually commenting on a published tetrad about television, the end result of television is everyone becomes a benevolent dictator in their own lives. That is the ultimate result of Hobbes. So the questioner perceived this correctly. That is a completely unsatisfactory way to organize society. It is a destructive way to organize our lives. And the way that McLuhan described this, he called it the inner trip as the final result of the electric media environment. We have already, to perhaps an aspect of Joyce's question, we've already seen this underway. I'm going to say something that may surprise some of you here. My guess is that a lot of you are trying to figure out, as we often do in these sort of conversations, what is his politics? What is he a conservative? Is he a liberal? A progressive? He's obviously not that. I told you I wasn't a progressive. Well, that means I must be a conservative. Maybe that's where the Margaret Thatcher question comes from. I'm not a conservative. I'm a radical. We're now experiencing a roller coaster of radical proportions. So, the Hobbesian view of the world, ultimately resulting in a bunch of hostile individuals, is correctly being confronted by a notion of social justice, which you can find wherever you look. Just scratch the surface. Scratch the surface in a conservative conversation, you'll find social justice. Social justice is a 19th century term. It cannot be avoided. But naturally, as these environments tend to distort our lives, it winds up in a very bizarre expression. This is the topic of woke. So again, I'm saying to our friend Bill Frezza, whose mailing list that some of us are on, has completely gone nuts about trying to critique wokeism. I am not going to do that here. Instead, what I'm going to suggest is that the widespread recognition of the need for social justice is already an expression of an attempt to return to natural law. The people who proposed social justice in the 19th century were Catholics, in particular Jesuits, who had been trained in natural law. Social justice is an aspect of natural law in Catholic social teaching, which originated in the 19th century, from the same people who gave us social justice. It's called solidarity. And so the evidence is already in front of us. People are no longer going to put up with a war of all against all. Hobbes and those like him are no longer acceptable. And so whatever you might think about the expression of wokeism, about campuses shouting down, by the way, a recent poll that I've seen, I'm sure there are people who know more about this than I do. More than 50% of those polled, today's undergraduates, appear to agree that it is perfectly correct to go to a lecture, somebody who you think is not reflecting social justice, and shout them down. This is the whole free speech argument. That is a distorted, which is exactly what you expect to see. So to the extent that natural law is seen through an electric pair of spectacles, if the perspective, if the lens that's being used on this is that past television lens, the end result is going to wind up looking pretty weird. I find this woke effort to be a emphatic example of a searching attempt to return to a much more natural understanding of our relationships to each other. So answering Joyce's question, or a part of Joyce's question here, is it almost is impossible to not find this going on today. I'm going to answer the rest of Joyce's question briefly, and then Shrikant can continue here. What happens to our kids who have apparently abandoned logical structures, org charts, methods, filing systems, and are taking it for granted that we can search for things? Search is at the heart of the transition into a digital environment. So first off, Joyce, that expression may be cause for concern in the way that it presents itself, but at the same time, as I've underscored social justice, I'm saying this experience today is that transition from electric to digital. And in truth, when I have said that we can't have a dark age because we are carrying around all of human knowledge, that carrying around of all human knowledge in our pockets clearly requires an indexing system. And that indexing, the Google indexing, in their case called Bigtable, and yes, as a matter of fact, originally paid for by the intelligence community. The original basis of Google was if you have a completely unlabeled, if you have all of human knowledge, but it has not been organized into a database. So I know Joyce and Doc understand what a database is and how this is all organized. It's a filing system. The rejection of that old database is at the origin of why NSA and others funded the project at Stanford that led to Google, originally called Bigtable, later in public domain known as Hadoop. This is a system that takes advantage of the fact that you can pre-compute the relationships between words. We will get much better at that. But this shift, Joyce, from filing to indexing as a way of organizing databases of human knowledge, is another reflection of something that has already happened and is already being expressed, probably imperfectly and poorly, in our children's understanding of human knowledge.
Wonderful. Let's take another question that was related to that about organization of knowledge, about Jefferson's library or any other system of organization of knowledge. So any thoughts about organization of knowledge?
Well, I'll repeat myself here, and I hope that you all examine this challenge in your own life. My library, I went nuts, I guess. I had a fair amount of time and a fair amount of money, and Debbie was with me on some of these expeditions where we'd come back with boxes and boxes of books from some barn someplace in Vermont. I don't know how many books I have, but I do know I have roughly 600 linear feet of bookshelves. 10 books per foot implies around 6,000 books. There is no way for me to organize them. I hope that someday somebody is going to invent a system that allows me to take a photograph of a bookshelf, figure out based upon the names and the colors, the spines of the books and so forth, what the ISBN numbers are, and then give me multiple cuts, multiple ways, a Ted Nelson hyperlinked way of understanding all of this. There are portions of my library that are organized chronologically. There are portions that are organized topically. There's some portions that are organized alphabetically. None of it is organized based on the color of the cover of the book or the height of the book. But I have I've profoundly experienced what I suspect you have also. There is no method, single method, for organizing all of these things. It is an organic problem, not a systematic problem. And the failure of systems to accomplish this, Library of Congress numbers, as everybody here knows, and really this is the reason why I went wild and have so many books, is because as a result of the shift to digital, libraries have been getting rid of their books because they have been indexed. They no longer have to keep. So Shrikant and I drove past the 42nd Street New York Public Library last night. After dinner, we drove down Fifth Avenue, taking Shrikant home. And I said, boy, I used to spend a lot of time in that building. Oh, really? He said, why? Well, I'm not an academic. In fact, when I got academic credentials, I quickly discovered that the good stuff was not on the shelves anymore. It was sitting in professors' offices. Well, as you may well know, the 42nd Street Research Branch of the New York Public Library has very few books in the building anymore. It used to be the entire space underneath Bryant Park was filled with shelves. Now they're in warehouses in New Jersey. Somebody who wants to do serious research at New York Public Library can still do that, but they have come to recognize that as they are researching topic A, they put their slips in for topic B, which they expect to be delivered to their study carrel next week, because it's going to have to get on a truck and move from New Jersey back into New York. So we have already made these transitions. We have already given up on library organization. We have moved into a world which is digital and indexed. And so I have a lot of books with Library of Congress stickers on the spine, which then have a big stamp on the first page, discarded. So it is a combination of all of this that has led to me. Now, I also tell you, as you probably, or many of you know, you don't need to buy books anymore. In most cases, there is this bootlegged scanning system that gets away with it. generally going under the heading of libgen. zlib is one of the things that feeds into this. I would say in about maybe 70% of the time when I'm looking for something, I can find it scanned and put it on my computer. The other 30%, I have to actually go and buy the text, and particularly if it's brand new. So there's still a steady stream of books coming in the front door. There's still a problem I have in figuring out where to put them, but that has been enormously reduced for all the reasons we're talking about.
Wonderful. Last, I want to bring up the question. Give me just a second. I don't think it's showing up correctly here. Okay. I want to bring up the exegesis because the core of your point is that we need new methods. We need to go back to the old methods, whether it is the tetrads, or whether it is the four causes of Aristotle, or whether it is exegesis. Now, in this group, we are actually in the process of studying the Gospel of John. And I just, on your recommendation, I've started looking at Thomas Aquinas' commentary on John, and I can see the power of exegesis in that, because that is the core method that he's using. Right. So can you go ahead and briefly describe the four parts of exegesis and how each of them connect to the Aristotle causes and the tetrads?
Doug Rushkoff is an old friend of mine. Many of you may be familiar with him. Maybe you've read some of his books. Doug asked me that question, same question that Shrikant asked, about 10 years ago. And I tried to answer it in a way that I'm sure is problematic. If you take a look at the way that I listed, the sequence in which I listed, which is methodological. And so I'm going to note here, as I said in my presentation when I mentioned Walter Ong, in fact, we don't need a new method. We have to get rid of methods and replace them with dialogue. So the relationship between the four causes, the relationship between the four senses of exegesis, the relationship between any one of these groupings was deliberately diagrammed by Marshall McLuhan. And here I'm going to underscore that one of the few people who I know, I only know a few thousand people, I guess, but Doc Searles has gone out of his way to study this, to discuss this at length, particularly the tetrad. He has truly gone out of his way to try to master this process. And my guess is that Doc has found it difficult when he writes about this, blogs about this, to get people to grasp what he's doing. I run the tetrad group on Facebook. I have, at this point, multiple times, there's 50, 60, 70 people on the group. So this isn't thousands, but a lot of people said, oh, tetrads, that might be interesting. Some of them even know a lot about this. I've repeatedly tried to get people to offer tetrads. Maybe they're embarrassed. Maybe Doc is at the point in his life where he doesn't care if people throw something at him when he tries to do this. But I don't think that's it. I think what Doc has discovered, I think what I've discovered on Facebook is that instead of method, what we need to do is retrieve dialogue. And dialogue requires people who have a common sensibility. They have to have the ability to share premises and talk to each other. We're not quite there yet, particularly in our age group. So one of the projects, as I noted before, of the Center for the Study of Digital Life is to launch a graduate school. One of the most, called Trivium University, one of the most important experimental results, which I hope to be able to report initial results on a year from now as we launch this, is whether the smart 20-somethings are capable of dialogue around 4 simultaneously shared views. So the relationship amongst these causes, amongst these quadrants of the tetrad, amongst these 4 levels of exegesis, I fell into the methodological approach when I listed them. So if you take the first, second, third, and fourth columns, my suggestion in my memo to Doug Rushkoff, which has been circulated a lot of other places, was to try to draw correspondences amongst them. The literal exegesis, I believe, has a correspondence, and there are probably other. You asked about relationships. The answer is there are many relationships amongst these things. But in my attempt to get this across to Doug and others, I drew correspondence between the literal sense of exegesis, formal cause, and retrieval. And so you'll see each of these. You'll see efficient causality mapping into moral exegesis, that being the enhancement level. When I showed this to Eric McLuhan, who wrote the book, literally, Laws of Media, was published in 1988. Marshall McLuhan died in 1980. Marshall McLuhan did not write that book. It's Marshall and Eric McLuhan on the cover. It was written by Eric McLuhan because he and his father uniquely worked on this after McLuhan had been canceled. The whole idea of cancel culture has been with us actually for quite a while, and Marshall ran into a buzzsaw, and Eric became his last collaborator. He didn't like it at all. We dialogued about it. He's probably right. I'm probably falling into the trap of attempting to be methodological. These are surround environmental situations which require common sensibilities, which require, most importantly, the ability for us to share certain premises and then disagree with each other in dialogue. So Thomas Aquinas's commentary on De Anima and his commentary on John's Gospel and his various other commentaries are not the same as other people who shared his premises. There's a lot of commentaries in that time period on these same texts and a lot of disagreements while sharing sensibilities. My suggestion is not that we're going to stop all of a sudden agree with each other. My suggestion is not that we're all of a sudden going to have the same answer to the same question. My suggestion is exactly what Doc has done. We're going to come up with different answers. There is no single valid tetrad to describe the effects of any of these artifacts. You can emphasize one part of it or another part of it. You can completely substitute other terms for it. That's the way the 4 senses operate. And that just leads to confusion, conflict, unless it is pinned to human dialogue. The method and the end of dialogue that Walter Ong wrote about is the situation, the cul-de-sac, the end of the road we have fallen into. We are now in the process already with very substantial evidence that we have begun down a different approach. And the result of this will be the new sciences that I've been suggesting throughout this talk.
This has been great. So any closing thoughts and your closing statement, please?
Stick with us, folks. We're going on a wild ride the next couple of weeks. The digital sphere in the digital psychotechnological environment is what has given us what I suspect Doc was suggesting in the name change from Facebook to Meta. Some people are they are already attempting to replace human beings with something that is not organic. Human beings are not going to live on Mars. When you hear people talking about space travel and galactic civilizations, that is not a human conversation. That is something quite different. And so the digital sphere will be the topic for the next 2 weeks. We're going to detail that as best we can, much as we've done with East and West. And then we're going to wrap all of this up. And so as Shrikant has invited me, I'm going to try to quote from memory instead of having it in front of me. The statement that I have been opening and closing, I skipped it in the opening here. Let me close with this. We no longer live in the modern world. Digital technology has already tossed us over the fence. We're already living in a radically different civilization. If we wish to act responsibly under these new conditions, which is to say, not be thrown down the hill, not be tossed into situations where we're reduced to trying to apply methods, abstract, and literally reduce what we're living with, hanging on to that reductionist past. If we want to act responsibly, we have no choice but to do what Doc just suggested we do and what he has personally done. We must drill down on this. We must understand these effects. That is what this course has been designed to provoke, to assist. I thank you all very much. I particularly thank Shrikant, but I thank all of you for hanging with us. Come back next week, and we're going to go on another roller coaster ride. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for your questions. Always great questions. Really appreciate them. See you next time. Bye.